Welcome to Wild Lore Bedtime Stories. Tonight you'll hear The One Who Named the Stars. This is the story of the myth, a voice that echoes what came before, a vessel for the stories that outlive us all. If this is your archetype, this is the ancient knowing you carry, not as a burden, but as a gift. The stars were the same stars her grandfather had shown her. She stood at the edge of the mesa, the wind lifting her hair, the medallion warm against her chest. Below, the canyon stretched in shadows and silence, carved by water that had been flowing since before her people had names. Above, the sky opened like a dark bowl scattered with light. The same patterns, the same stories, the same ancient map that had guided her ancestors across this land for 1,000 generations. She touched the medallion without thinking. It was gold, worn smooth by the hands that had held it before hers. Her grandfather's hands, his mother's hands, and before that, hands she would never know, but whose touch she could feel pressed into the metal like memory. Her grandfather had given it to her on the night he died. "This has been carried a long time," he had said, his voice already thin, already traveling somewhere she couldn't follow. "Now you carry it, not because you're special, because you're here, because the chain doesn't break." She had been 22, still young enough to think she understood what he meant. Now, 12 years later, she was only beginning to learn. The stories had come with the medallion, not written down. Their people didn't write things down, not the sacred things, but passed from mouth to ear, breath to memory, each generation adding their voice to the chorus. Stories about the stars and how they got their names. Stories about the canyon and the water that carved it. Stories about the first people and the mistakes they made and the wisdom they found on the other side of those mistakes. She knew them all. She had been telling them for years now, at gatherings, at ceremonies, to children who looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of her own childhood eyes, looking up at her grandfather. But lately, something had shifted. The stories felt heavy in a way they hadn't before. She could feel them pressing on her chest, crowding her throat, filling every corner of her mind until there was no room left for her own thoughts. She had become so full of the old words that she couldn't find her new ones. Her grandfather's voice drifted up from memory, the way it always did when she stood beneath these stars. "You are not the first, you will not be the last, but you are the one who is here." She had always heard those words as a comfort. Tonight they felt like a question. What did it mean to be the one who was here? To carry the stories faithfully, unchanged, exactly as they had been given? Or to be present, truly present, in a world that her grandfather had never seen? The stars offered no answer. They never did. They just burned. The same way they had burned for 1,000,000 years, waiting for someone to look up and name them. She pulled her jacket tighter and began the walk back down the mesa. The medallion swung gently against her heart and the old words hummed in her blood. And somewhere between the stars and the sand, she felt the first stirring of a question she didn't yet know how to ask. Act 1. The Call to Carry. She had been the keeper of stories for 10 years now. It was not a title anyone gave her. There was no ceremony, no appointment. It was simply what happened when her grandfather died and she was the one who remembered, the one who had sat at his feet longest, listened most carefully, asked the questions that made him smile. His slow, patient smile. "You have the ear," he had told her once. "Some people listen with their minds. You listen with your bones. That's rare. That's the gift." She hadn't felt gifted. She had felt chosen in a way she never asked for, burdened with words that weren't hers, responsible for keeping alive something that had survived for centuries before she was born. But she had done it. Year after year, she had told the stories. At winter gatherings, she recited the tale of how the first snow came to be. At harvest celebrations, she spoke the words that thanked the earth for its giving. At funerals, she carried the old prayers from her mouth to the sky, trusting that they would find their way. The people listened, the children learned. The chain didn't break, and somewhere in those 10 years she had begun to disappear. She noticed it first in small ways. Friends would ask her opinion about something, a decision they were facing, a problem they needed to solve, and she would find herself reaching for a story instead of an answer. My grandfather used to say, "There's an old tale about..." The ancestors teach us. She had become a library, not a person, a vessel, but not a voice. Then came the invitation. A university 300 miles away wanted her to speak, not to her people, but to strangers, students and scholars who studied stories the way scientists studied rocks, breaking them into pieces to see how they worked. They wanted her to explain the myths, to analyze them, to translate them into a language the outside world could understand. Her first instinct was to refuse. The stories weren't meant for that. They weren't specimens to be examined. They were living things, meant to be spoken in the right place, at the right time, to ears that were ready. But something else stirred beneath the refusal. A curiosity she hadn't felt in years. A wondering, what would happen if she spoke the stories in a new place? To new ears? Would they change? Would she? She took the medallion in her hand and closed her eyes. Her grandfather's voice came, steady as always. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you are the one who is here. Here. Not in the past with the ancestors. Not in the future with those who would come after. Here, in this moment, with this choice." She opened her eyes and picked up the phone to accept the invitation. Act 2, The Ascent Through Doubt. The university was nothing like home. She walked through corridors lined with fluorescent lights, past doors with names and titles she didn't recognize, into a lecture hall filled with chairs bolted to the floor in neat, unnatural rows. Everything here was square. Everything here was certain. There was no room for the wind to move, no space for the stories to breathe. She touched the medallion and tried to feel her grandfather's presence. He felt very far away. The weeks that followed were disorienting. She gave her talk and the students applauded politely. They asked questions, intelligent questions, curious questions, but something in their eyes told her they were listening from a distance, the way you listen to music from a country you will never visit. Interested? Removed. She began to doubt. The professor who had invited her asked to meet for coffee. He was kind, earnest, genuinely fascinated by the stories she carried. But his fascination felt like a scalpel. "What I don't understand," he said, leaning forward, "is how you can tell stories you didn't create. Doesn't that feel limiting? Don't you ever want to add your own interpretation? Your own voice?" She stared at him, the question lodging in her chest like a splinter. "The stories aren't mine to change," she said. "I'm just the carrier. But you're also a person, with your own experiences, your own perspective. Doesn't that matter?" She didn't have an answer, or rather, she had the answer she had always given. The one about tradition, about respect, about the chain that couldn't break. But for the first time, the words felt hollow in her mouth. That night, alone in her hotel room, she looked at the medallion and felt a strange resentment rising. She had given her whole life to carrying these stories. She had shaped herself into a vessel exactly as she was supposed to. And now a stranger with a coffee cup was asking if she had ever wanted to be something else. The worst part was, she didn't know. She almost left. Almost bought a bus ticket home. Almost packed her bag and fled back to the canyon where the stories made sense, where no one asked her to explain or justify or analyze. She got as far as the bus station, sat on a metal bench with her bag at her feet, watching the schedules flicker on the departure board. A child sat down beside her, small, maybe 5 or 6, with dark eyes that watched everything. Her mother was at the ticket counter, distracted. "Are you going somewhere?" the child asked. "I don't know," she admitted. The child considered this. "My grandma says when you don't know where to go, you should stay still and listen. The right direction finds you. She almost laughed. A stranger's child in a bus station 300 miles from home, quoting wisdom that sounded exactly like something her grandfather would say. She thought of his voice. You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you are the one who is here. Here, in a bus station, with a choice. She could run back to the canyon where the stories were safe and unchanged, and she never had to question her place in them. Or she could stay and struggle and find out what it meant to be a vessel that was also a voice. The child's mother called her away. The departure board flickered. The bus to home pulled up to the curb. She didn't get on. The challenge came from an unexpected place. A student, barely 20, who stayed after one of her talks with a question that had teeth. You say the stories are sacred, the student said, that they shouldn't be changed. But stories change all the time. That's how they survive. If you freeze them exactly as they were, aren't you killing them? She felt her defenses rise. I'm preserving them. Are you? Or are you embalming them? The student's eyes were sharp but not cruel. A preserved thing is dead. A living thing changes. Which are your stories? She opened her mouth to argue. To explain about tradition, about respect, about the weight of carrying something that had survived for centuries. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere beneath her certainty, she felt the truth of what the student was saying. She had been so focused on keeping the stories exactly as they were that she had stopped letting them breathe. Stopped letting them grow. Stopped letting them speak to new ears in new ways. Her grandfather had never told the stories exactly the same way twice. She remembered that now. He had shifted them, shaped them, adjusted the details to fit the listener, the moment, the need. The core remained, but the edges were always moving. She had been trying to become stone when she was supposed to be water. I don't know, she said to the student. I think I've been afraid to find out. The student nodded. Fear makes sense, but so does change. Maybe that's what being a vessel means. Not holding something still, but letting it move through you. She walked back to her hotel that night with the student's words echoing in her chest and her grandfather's medallion warm against her skin. Something was shifting. Something old was making room for something new. Act 3. The Naming of Stars. The final lecture was standing room only. Word had spread somehow about the woman from the canyon, the keeper of stories, the one who spoke of stars and ancestors and things that didn't fit in textbooks. Students had brought friends. Professors had brought colleagues. Even people from outside the university had come, drawn by something they couldn't name. She stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, so different from the faces at home. So strange. And yet, beneath the strangeness, so familiar. Eyes that wanted to understand. Hearts that needed stories the same way lungs needed air. She touched the medallion and felt her grandfather's presence. Closer now than it had been in weeks. But before she could speak, she had to face what had been following her since she arrived. For 10 years, she had been vanishing into the stories. She saw it clearly now, how she had used the ancestors' words to avoid her own, how she had hidden behind tradition instead of standing beside it, how she had become so good at being a vessel that she had forgotten she was also a person, with her own questions, her own doubts, her own way of seeing the stars. The stories were not meant to erase her. They were meant to hold her, to give her roots so she could grow, not chains to keep her still. I am not the first, she whispered to herself. I will not be the last. But I am the one who is here, and here means me, not just them. She thought of all the times she had refused to let the stories bend. All the times she had insisted on the exact words, the precise phrasing, the letter of the tradition instead of its spirit. She had been so afraid of breaking the chain that she had wrapped it around her own throat. But her grandfather had never been rigid. He had been rooted, deeply, unshakably rooted. But his branches had moved with every wind. He had told the same story 100 different ways because he knew that a story was not its words. A story was its truth. And truth could wear many clothes. She didn't have to choose between the ancestors and herself. She could be both. She could carry the old words and speak new ones. She could be a vessel that was also a voice. The weight had been crushing her for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Carrying the stories had felt like a duty, a debt, an obligation she could never fully repay. She had bent under it, shaped herself to fit it, made herself smaller so the stories could be bigger. But what if carrying wasn't about shrinking? What if it was about expanding? What if the stories were not meant to fill her up and leave no room, but to fill her up and make her larger? To add to her instead of replacing her? She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, let the medallion rest against her heart like a companion instead of a chain. The stories were not her burden. They were her inheritance. And an inheritance was a gift, not a sentence. She looked out at the audience and set aside her notes. "I was going to tell you the old stories tonight," she said. "The ones my grandfather told me, that his grandmother told him, that have been passed down for more generations than anyone can count." The room was silent, waiting. "But I've realized something in my time here. Those stories don't need me to protect them. They've survived for 1,000 years without my help. They'll survive 1,000 more." She took a breath. What they need is not a guardian. They need a voice, a living voice, in a living body, standing in a living moment. They need someone who can carry them into places they've never been, to ears that have never heard them, in ways that make sense for right now. She touched the medallion. "My grandfather used to say, 'You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you are the one who is here.' I always thought that meant I should disappear into the chain, become just another link, invisible and interchangeable. But now I understand it differently." She looked up at the ceiling, imagining the stars beyond it. Being here means being here, present, alive, myself. The stories don't need a recording, they need a relationship. They need me to bring my questions to them, my doubts, my experiences, and to let them speak back in ways I've never heard before. She smiled, the first real smile she had felt in months. "So tonight, I'm not going to tell you the old stories exactly as I learned them. I'm going to tell them the way they want to be told, right now, to you, in this room. I'm going to let them breathe." She began to speak. The old words came, but they came differently, shaped by the room, by the listening, by the woman she had become in the weeks since leaving home. The stories flowed through her like water, taking the shape of the vessel that held them, becoming something ancient and brand new all at once. And as she spoke, she felt her grandfather's hand on her shoulder, not holding her in place, but pushing her gently forward. She walked out of the building and looked up. The city lights were too bright for stars. Only a few of the strongest ones punched through the glow. But she knew they were there. The same stars her grandfather had named for her on a mesa 1,000 miles away, burning with the same light that had traveled 1,000,000 years to reach her eyes. She touched the medallion. It was still warm. It would always be warm. Tomorrow she would go home, back to the canyon, the mesa, the people who had been waiting for her stories. But she would not go back the same. She had carried the old words into new places and found that they could survive the journey. More than survive, they could grow. And she had grown with them. Her grandfather's voice came one last time, softer now, satisfied. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you are the one who is here. And you have done what the one who is here must do. You have kept the chain alive by letting it change." She smiled up at the dim stars. For 1,000 generations, her people had looked at the same sky and named what they saw. They had made stories from starlight, found patterns in the chaos, passed meaning from mouth to ear like a sacred fire. And now she was part of that, not as a guardian standing at the edge, but as a voice in the chorus, adding her note to the song. The stories were not hers, but the telling was, and that was enough. That was everything. She turned and walked toward the bus station. Not to run away this time, but to go home, to carry what she had learned back to the canyon, to tell the old stories in new ways, to teach the next keeper that the chain was not a constraint, but a connection. The stars burned on above her, and in the space between the ancient and the new, she burned with them. This was the story of the myth. If you are the myth, your voice carries what came before. You are a vessel for the ancient, the archetypal, the truths that outlive any single life. Your gift is transmission, and your power is learning to be present within the passing. You are not the first, you will not be the last, but you are the one who is here, and that is everything. You've just heard the Myth Bedtime Story, one of the 8 archetypes in the Wild Lore framework. To discover your own archetype and learn to carry your stories with presence and power, take the Wild Lore quiz at wildlore.co. Your story is waiting to be told.